is activity TS99 and it's a very simple assembly made of 3 parts. And what I would like to do is to set up the constraints so that it looks like what you see there. On purpose, I want this crank to have a non-circular cross section, okay, but to have an elliptical one. You'll see why when we do that. Now, one other thing is that in the drawing, it looks like the thickness of this rod is the same as the thickness of this crank. That makes things, I don't want to say it's easier, but you have to be careful if these two thicknesses are not the same. You have to be a little bit careful and perhaps do extra work. Okay, let's not worry about the dimensions here. I'm going to save this thing, file, save management, save as. I have a folder by that name. Let's see now. It's right here. TS99. So I'm going to put it there. Let me insert the wall, insert a new part in there. And I'll call this thing the wall. Right click properties, wall. And wall. Let's make it. Double click on this vertical plane. I will sketch. Okay, so if I'm going to make it like that, the wall should have a pin up here and a hole down there. Okay, so let's go do that. I'll draw a rectangle here, like so. Draw a circle there. That's going to become a pin. Draw a circle down here. That's going to become a hole. Okay, exit. We'll do a multi-pad because if I do a pad, I'll get 2 holes at the top and the bottom. But I don't want that. So this, I'm going to make this thing 0.5. 0.5. Oops, not done yet. Multi-pad. This guy is the hole down here, which I'll leave it at 0. And this up there should be a pin. So I'll make this thing maybe 2. There. Okay. All the way to the top. Insert a new part in there. And I'll call this thing the crank, elliptical crank. Properties, elliptical crank. Okay. We copy and paste this thing. Let's make it. Double click on elliptical crank on that plane. I will sketch. We want to hold this size, so why don't you circle that size? So why don't I project that circle? There we are, and then do the rest of the elliptical crank. So here's an ellipse, different ways of doing it. So for example, I'll do it like that. Okay, and since it is not constrained, I can just move this thing where I want. Exit. All right, once again, I'll do a multi-path here. Multi-path. Sketch. So this is the big ellipse, so I'll make that thing 1. Actually, I'll make it 0.5. And this is going to be the shaft over here or the pin over there. I'll make it also 2. Good. We go all the way to the top, and we're going to insert the rod. So insert a new part. Call it the rod. Let's make it. So on that plane, I'll sketch. Okay, so I want to project that circle. So project that circle and do the rest of the rod. And the rod is basically a rectangle. I'll do it like this. Okay, that's it. We're going to do a pad here. So pad 0.5. And notice that I made it 0.5 the same thickness as this, because eventually I want to bring this thing down and make it touch that. And you'll see there's some issues involved. So we go all the way to the top, and let's try to apply the assembly constraints. Why don't we move these apart? So move it here, move it, move it there. Let me say okay. Anchor the wall. Coincidence between this axis and that axis, and coincidence between, for example, this plane and that plane. Okay, update. Good. Now we're going to put this pin inside of that hole. So coincidence between this pin and that hole, and coincidence between that plane and this plane, and update. And obviously that's not what we want, so just double click on this last one and flip the arrows, and then I'm not sure, did I flip them? Not yet. Flip the arrows and now update. We say okay. So this is pretty much what we want. Now, what we want to do is, let me go all the way to the top first, save everything. What I want to do is bring this and put it in contact with that, put it on top of that. But first of all, let me rotate that guy a little bit. So rotation about this axis. Yep. Okay, good. Now, if you may be tempted, first of all, if you try to do coincidence between this edge and that edge, you have a problem. You won't be able to pick it. Okay, so that doesn't work. If you try to do contact between this bottom plane and that plane, that doesn't work either. It works with this, but that's not what you want. So the question is, how do we bring this thing down? If this actually was uh, if this actually was a cylinder, okay, you may be able to do that, but with an ellipse you can't. As a matter of fact, you will be able to do it with if this was a cylinder, cross-section circle, then that would be okay, but not here. So the question, how are we going to do this? I mean, basically you have to bring it down and put it there. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a point on this edge of the bar or rod, and a point on this edge of the crank, and make that thing coincident. Okay, so in order to make a point on this edge of the wall of the rod, well, you have to go to the rod, double click on it, and get a point, and use, for example, on a curve, and select your curve right there, and for example that blue point, you say okay, right there. And then to make a point on the crank, elliptical crank, you go to the elliptical crank. Notice that I am in elliptical crank now, part design. And by the same token, point on a curve and select that curve and select the point that you want. I mean, basically, it doesn't matter what point. The only reason I made these two the same width, 0.5, is because if these were not the same width, we can't do the same thing. We can't make these coincident. Then you probably have to go and do the back edges, but that's okay. We did it all the way to the top, and coincident. Sorry, update. Oh, I have to create a coincidence constraint. Coincidence between this point and that point. Update. Now, the only thing is that this coincidence, you have to it, this is fine, but it's not touching that. Okay, that's the only problem. So you have to do more work if you want this thing actually to touch that. And there are different ways of doing it. For example, okay, notice that this, although it brought it down, but it's actually going through that crank. So there, there are different ways of fixing this problem. One of them is actually get rid of this constraint. Let me undo this. Let me undo that. And let me get rid of this constraint and do it a different way. So I'm going to say delete. Now let's try to do it a different way. Obviously, point to point is going to cause a problem. So I'm going to do a coincidence between this point. Instead of selecting that point, I'm going to select the edge. And you might say update. You might say, wait a minute, that's the same kind of a problem. But if you go to move, manipulate, check this box, see that with respect to constraint, check this box, and then rotate, rotate about this axis. See, this is a free rotation about the axis that you selected, but make sure this is checked and move this. You see this? It reaches that point and you can clear that thing. So this point that I created on the crank was not used. I created a point on the rod and I made a coincidence between that point and this edge. Of course, there is an interference, and I literally manipulated that so that that clearance is resolved. So let's check now. See if I move things apart and update, do they go back to where they belong? Let's see now. So for example, I go tra translation like let me uncheck that. A translation like that, translation like this, and I say okay, update. You see? Let's try it again. Uh, so for example, notice that I had to uncheck this because otherwise you will not be able to rotate it like this. So another one like that, and then update. They go, they don't go quite back to where they were. However, you can always resolve that. You can always resolve that by checking this, select rotation about that axis. Okay, and then lift this up and say okay. So in a sense, uh, one possibility, if you want to be able to rotate this in an arbitrary, crazy way, here's what you can do. Here's what you can do. You can create a point, another point, another point on the crank on this edge. So what do I mean by that? So let's go to the crank. Where is that? You go to the crank or elliptical crank. This point that I created, this one, I don't need it. I'm going to delete that. However, I'm going to create a point exactly at this location. So what do I mean by that? So point, okay, uh, on a curve, on a curve, this curve, okay, this curve, okay. Now this blue, the blue dot, this blue dot, see this blue dot? You bring it all the way to that location. You select it, say okay, all right. And now you create a coincidence between this point and the other point. Now notice that that guy, I can let it go. This one, the one that I did with the point on the rod and the edge. So I don't need it. So I can go to the assembly. And if you don't believe me, I'm not going to delete this. I'm going to deactivate it. Now I create a coincidence between these 2 points. What 2 points? The one on the rod, the one on the rod, which is this, and the one on the this is the rod, and the one on the elliptical crank. And now update. Okay, good. Notice that I am not using this anymore. So if I do any crazy rotation, translational rotation, for example, let me uncheck that. Of course, you have to uncheck that. If you're going to rotate, you have to uncheck that. Like that, like this, like so, like so. You see this? And update, they should go back to where they were with no interference right there. So I kind of, even if I delete this, it's deactivated, it doesn't matter. It is already deleted, but deactivated. So let me rotate these things like that, like this, like so, and any other thing that you want. When I update, they go back to where they belong, there. See that intermediate one between this point and that edge, I created it, and it was useful for me to resolve that the clearance, but then I created another point at the same location as the one on the rod and made a coincidence between them so that uh, if I move things apart and update, it'll go back to the original position. This is very important, okay? Because the one that I did earlier for you, between that point and that edge, not solve my problem. You could see that depending on how much you rotate it, once you update it, it may interfere again with each other. Good luck.